The city's skyline was dark, not from nightfall, but from the absence of the towering figure that once ruled it. Heroes once larger than life now lived only in stories. The streets whispered of past victories, of a time when a man in a red suit could halt earthquakes with a single fist or freeze the skies with a gaze. But that was before. Before he disappeared, before the powers faded, before the legend crumbled. Jackson never liked talking about the past. He hated the idea that it was all over, that the world had moved on. "You can't just stop being who you were," he would mutter to himself, pacing in his small apartment as if the walls were closing in on him. His fingers, once capable of lighting fires with a mere flick, trembled now. His eyes, which had seen countless battles, seemed tired, too tired to even blink at the city below. "Jackson?" The voice came from behind him, sharp and intrusive. "We need you." He turned, trying to fight the irritation that welled up with that familiar, condescending tone. Angela, her suit still pristine as if she hadn't seen a single drop of sweat in years, stood in the doorway. Jackson wasn't sure why he still let her call on him. She wasn't one of them, the new generation of heroes who had everything they needed and didn't need anyone. They were faster, stronger, more efficient. Angela was more of a reminder of the past, a living symbol of all the things Jackson could never be again. "I'm done with that," he muttered, glancing at the broken remnants of his old uniform draped over a chair in the corner of the room. "You're not done," Angela snapped, crossing her arms over her chest. "We need you to train them." "Train who?" Jackson's voice was low, heavy with the weight of the years that had passed since he last threw a punch. "I have nothing left to teach. I've got no powers, Angela. I'm just me." Angela's eyes softened for a moment, but the hardness never truly left her. "Jackson, they don't have powers either." He stared at her, disbelief creeping up his spine. "What do you mean, they don't have powers? They're supposed to be what exactly? The next generation of gods?" Angela raised an eyebrow as if daring him to question her. "The truth is, Jackson, we've been creating these heroes who can't think for themselves. They've relied on their powers so long that they don't even know how to use their minds, let alone make decisions under pressure. They need someone who's been there, someone who can teach them what it means to be human, not just powerful." Jackson snorted, a dry laugh escaping him before he could catch it. "Human? You want me to teach them how to be human? What's left of that in me?" "You've survived it," Angela said, her voice softening again. "You've lived without powers longer than they ever will. You know what it's like to be broken and still get back up. They need that." Jackson rubbed his face with a hand, the weight of the years pressing down on him. What could he teach them? How to live in a world where everything had been taken away, where the impossible no longer seemed so. "Why don't you just let them, I don't know, rely on their new technology?" Jackson muttered, still not looking at her. You've got your gadgets, your lasers, your quick fixes. What do you need me for?" Angela stepped forward, closer now, and there was a flicker of something in her eyes that made him pause. "Because they're not you, Jackson, and you're the only one who can show them how to fight without a power, how to survive when everything else fails." The words cut through him, sharper than any blade he had ever faced. The last time he'd fought, he'd felt something like hope, the kind of hope that had made him think he could change everything. But now it was gone. The feeling that used to course through him like electricity had faded into the background of his life. The sun had barely set when he found himself standing in front of the facility, staring up at the sleek modern building that hummed with activity. Inside, they were waiting. The new recruits, the ones who would inherit the mantle of protection. Only they didn't know how to protect anything, least of all themselves. Jackson sighed and stepped inside. The recruits were sitting in a small conference room, each one looking more like a student than a hero. There was no grandeur about them, no flashy capes or intimidating masks. Their faces were young, and their eyes held a spark, an unrefined, raw energy that screamed potential. But it wasn't enough. Jackson could see it in their faces. They were scared. They weren't ready. "Sit down," he said, his voice gravelly from years of disuse. They obeyed, the room falling into an uncomfortable silence. Jackson leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. He looked at each of them, trying to find the right words. Words that could give them hope, or at least some semblance of it. "Let me guess," he began slowly, his eyes narrowing. "You've all been told that you're going to save the world, right?" The recruits nodded, some eagerly, others unsure. They had heard it 1,000. Jackson's lips twisted into a bitter smile. "I'm here to tell you that's a load of crap." The room went still. "You think you're special because you have powers," he continued, his voice rising. "You think that because you can shoot fire from your hands or lift cars over your head, you're invincible. But I'm telling you now, those powers won't save you when it counts. And when they fail, when everything you've ever relied on disappears, you'll be left with nothing." The silence in the room grew heavier, the weight of Jackson's words sinking in. He saw their eyes dart around, searching for answers in the cracks in the walls, the corners of the room. "What you need to understand," he said, his voice softer now, "is that the real fight is within you. It's about who you are when your powers are gone. It's about surviving when the world stops handing you victories." Angela had been watching from the door, and now she stepped forward, her expression unreadable. Jackson didn't care anymore if she approved. This was about the recruits now. This was about showing them the truth. "Are you ready to face that truth?" he asked them. The recruits exchanged nervous glances. Some nodded, others stayed silent. Jackson sighed. "All right then, let's get to work." The training was grueling. Days passed, and Jackson pushed them harder than they ever thought they could be pushed. He ran them through the motions, making them rely on their wits and instincts rather than their powers. And slowly, one by one, they began to change. But Jackson wasn't done yet. He couldn't be. He still had one final lesson to teach. One that they would never forget. Jackson had been at the training facility for over a week, pushing the recruits to their limits, testing their stamina, and breaking their reliance on their powers. His methods were harsh, but he knew no other way. The recruits were learning, and some were even starting to show signs of progress. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever was, but they were improving. That was something, at least. It was late afternoon when everything changed. The sound of a siren blared through the facility's hallways, the sharp, urgent tone breaking through the monotony of Jackson's routine. He looked up from his paperwork, startled. He hadn't heard a siren like that in years. Angela was the first to move. She stood up quickly, glancing toward the door. "That's not good," she muttered, already moving toward the control room. Jackson followed without thinking, instincts kicking in before logic could catch up. As they entered the control room, the tension was palpable. The team at the monitors was already scrambling. Their faces were a mix of confusion and dread, eyes wide as they tried to make sense of the emergency signal flashing on the screen. "Angela, what's happening?" Jackson's voice was a low growl, but there was something else in it now, something sharper. Angela was already scanning the data. Her face paled, her brows furrowed in concentration. "There's an anomaly, a large energy spike, far beyond anything we've seen before." "Where?" Jackson demanded, stepping closer. "Here," Angela said, her finger pointing to a spot on the city's map displayed on the monitor. It was in the heart of the city, near an old, abandoned building that no one had thought twice about in years. The signal was coming from underground, buried deep beneath the crumbling streets. This is bad, Jackson. "This isn't something we can handle with the usual response teams." Jackson's stomach dropped. Something about the place, the way the map pinpointed the energy source, set off a deep, gut-wrenching feeling inside him. He didn't need Angela to tell him that this wasn't an ordinary threat. It was far worse. It felt too familiar. "Get the recruits together," Jackson said, voice suddenly cold. He turned to Angela, eyes hard. "We're going in." Angela opened her mouth to protest, but he cut her off with a glare.
"Now!"
The recruits assembled in minutes. They were nervous, fidgeting with the training equipment they barely knew how to use, their faces pale. Jackson could see the uncertainty in their eyes. They had been taught to believe that nothing could touch them, that their powers would protect them. But Jackson knew better. He had been the protector once. Now he was something different. Now he was just a man with memories that stung like raw scars. The facility's transport ship hummed to life, its engines purring beneath them as they sped toward the city. The sky overhead was turning dark, clouds gathering in ominous swirls. Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was coming was already here. The trip felt long, despite being just a few minutes. When they landed, the city's streets were eerily quiet. The usual hum of traffic was absent, and the distant chatter of the city seemed muffled, as if the world itself was holding its breath. They moved quickly, Jackson leading the group through the narrow, winding streets toward the abandoned building. There were no signs of life, nothing but the occasional flickering light from a distant lamppost. The energy was heavy in the air, thick with the unknown. "Stay sharp," Jackson said, his voice low but commanding. "Whatever's down there, it's not like anything you faced before." The recruits followed in tight formation, their steps almost in sync. They didn't talk. There was no room for chatter. Jackson could feel the weight of their unease pressing down on him, but he didn't let it show. His mind was already racing through contingency plans, running through every possible scenario. They reached the entrance to the building, a decrepit doorway framed by overgrown ivy. Jackson pushed it open with a creak, the door protesting as if it hadn't been used in years. Inside, the air was damp and cold, the smell of rot mixing with the earthy scent of old stone. The walls were covered in peeling paint, and the floors creaked underfoot as if the building itself were alive, groaning in protest. The energy signature from the monitors had pointed them to a staircase leading down into the basement. Jackson motioned for the recruits to follow him, but before they could take a step, a loud, cracking sound echoed through the building. Jackson froze, his senses heightened, his hand instinctively going to the small arsenal at his side. "Stay close," he whispered, his voice barely audible. He was aware of how tense everyone had become, the air thick with anticipation. They descended into the basement. The further down they went, the colder it became. The walls were lined with old rusted pipes, and the only light came from their flashlights, which cast eerie shadows on the walls. And then they saw it, a glowing, pulsing orb, suspended in mid-air, floating above the floor like some twisted piece of forgotten technology. It flickered erratically, like a heartbeat too fast, its glow growing and dimming in rhythm with an energy that Jackson could feel in his bones. "What the hell is that?" one of the recruits whispered, voice cracking in the silent space. "That," Jackson said, his voice tight, "is something that shouldn't exist." The orb hovered there, its energy rippling outward like waves in a pond. Jackson had seen something like it once, years ago in his final battle before his powers had begun to fade. But that had been a different time, a different place. He hadn't known then what he knew now. He hadn't realized the danger. "This isn't just a power surge," Jackson muttered under his breath. He stepped forward, the recruits hesitating behind him. "This is a trap." The energy from the orb intensified, suddenly reaching out toward them like a living thing. Jackson's heart pounded in his chest, but he wasn't afraid. Not anymore. He knew this game, even if it had changed. The rules might have been different, but he still knew how to play. "We need to shut it down," Jackson said quickly, already moving toward the center of the room. He could feel the pressure of the orb's energy, like 1,000 eyes watching him, waiting. And then, as if the universe had decided to test him, the ground shook beneath their feet. A low rumble filled the air, and Jackson's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just any trap. It was something far worse. Something he couldn't quite understand. The recruits looked to him for guidance, their faces painted with fear. But Jackson's eyes were locked on the orb, and for the first time in years he felt the surge of adrenaline that had once been his lifeblood. This wasn't just a fight for the future of the world, it was a fight for his own redemption. "We're going to need everything we have to stop this," Jackson said, voice steady despite the chaos. "And we start by working together. No one fights alone." He didn't wait for their reply. He stepped forward into the center of the storm. As Jackson and the recruits closed in on the pulsing orb, the air around them seemed to vibrate, charged with an energy so intense it felt like the walls of the basement were pressing in on them. The orb flickered erratically, casting an eerie glow over the room. But just as Jackson took another step toward it, a deafening crash rang out above their heads. The ground shook violently beneath their feet, and debris rained down from the ceiling. The recruits scattered instinctively, some diving for cover, others staggering to regain their balance. Jackson's hand shot out, catching the nearest recruit by the arm and pulling them away from a falling beam. The tremors continued, the whole building groaning in protest. It was like the entire city had started to collapse in on itself. "We need to move! Now!" Jackson barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. The recruits scrambled to their feet, eyes wide with panic. They didn't know what was happening, but Jackson had a sinking feeling in his gut that this was no ordinary earthquake. "Angela!" Jackson shouted, his eyes scanning the room, but she wasn't there. The sound of crashing metal filled the air, and Jackson turned just in time to see a section of the ceiling cave in where Angela had been standing moments earlier. The recruits had barely noticed, their focus still on the orb. "Angela!" Jackson called again, his heart racing. He couldn't afford to lose anyone now, not with this threat hanging over them. He dashed toward the crumbled section of the ceiling, shoving rubble aside with a force born of desperation. When he found her, she was unconscious, a trickle of blood staining her forehead. Jackson's breath caught in his chest and he pulled her into his arms, checking for any sign of life. Her pulse was weak, but she was alive. He wasn't going to lose anyone, not today. "Get the recruits out of here!" Jackson snapped, turning to one of the more level-headed recruits, a young woman named Claire. Her eyes were wide with fear, but she nodded and signaled to the others. They began to move toward the exit, but they were slowed down by the constant aftershocks and debris blocking their path. "We can't leave her behind," Claire shouted, glancing back at Jackson. "Go!" Jackson's voice was hoarse, the weight of the responsibility pressing down on him. "I'll take care of her, get to safety, and call for backup. Now!" Claire hesitated, her face a mixture of fear and uncertainty. But Jackson gave her a steady, unwavering look that brooked no argument. With one last look, she motioned for the others to follow her toward the exit. Jackson shifted Angela in his arms, the energy from the orb still crackling in the air, growing stronger by the second. There was no time to waste. He had to figure out what was causing this, what this orb truly was, and how to stop it before it tore them all apart. The orb began to pulse with more urgency, its glow brighter and faster. Jackson set Angela down as carefully as he could, then stood to face the source of the chaos. The recruits had made it outside, but the threat wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The moment he turned his attention to the orb, a voice, cold, familiar, cut through the tension. "You're too late, Jackson." Jackson's heart skipped a beat. He knew that voice. He had hoped he would never hear it again. Out of the shadows, a figure emerged, tall, cloaked in darkness, his features hidden beneath a hood. It was as though the very air around him grew colder, more oppressive. "Thorn," Jackson said, his voice a whisper, though it held the weight of years of history. "What the hell are you doing here?" Thorn smiled, a cold, calculating smile that sent a chill down Jackson's spine. "I should ask you the same thing. After all, this is my creation, my work. You really thought you could stop it? That you could stop me?" Jackson took a step forward, his hands tightening into fists. "This isn't just your work, Thorn. You're playing with forces you don't understand. You've already seen what happens when people like us, people who think they control power, try to manipulate things beyond our reach. It always ends badly." Thorn let out a soft laugh, the sound almost mocking. "Oh, Jackson, you've always been so naive. You can't stop this. Not now." The orb pulsed again, and Jackson could feel the air crackle with static. Thorn had somehow tapped into something ancient, something dangerous. The orb wasn't just some energy source, it was a conduit, a rift between worlds, and Thorn had found a way to open it. Jackson's mind raced. He had to think quickly. The longer they stood there, the stronger the energy became. The recruits were still outside, but if the orb was left unchecked, the whole building and possibly the entire city would come crashing down. "You're wrong," Jackson said, his voice low but filled with conviction. "I've got something you'll never understand." "Is that so?" Thorn's eyes glinted with a dangerous light. "What do you think you can do, Jackson? You're powerless now. The powers you once had are gone. You're just a man." Jackson's lips twisted into a tight smile. "I'm not just a man, and neither are the recruits. They might not have powers, but they've got something far stronger. Determination. And they'll fight for what's right. I'll make sure of it." Thorn's smile faltered for a split second, but he quickly recovered. Then I suppose you'll be the first to die." Before Jackson could react, a blast of energy surged from the orb, aiming directly at him. But just as it hit, a blur of motion flashed across his vision. One of the recruits, Claire, had returned, her hands glowing with the faintest hint of energy. She had barely begun to understand how to use her abilities, but she wasn't about to let Jackson fight alone. "Get down!" she shouted, leaping forward and intercepting the blast with a barrier of energy. The force of the collision sent her crashing to the ground, but she stood quickly, face set with determination. "I'm not leaving you," she said, voice shaking but firm. Jackson nodded at her, a fleeting look of gratitude flashing in his eyes. They were going to have to work together if they had any chance of surviving this. "You've got a lot to learn," Jackson said, stepping beside her and eyeing Thorn with renewed resolve. "But together we can stop him." Thorn's expression darkened, his hands glowing with a malevolent energy. "You think you can stop me with a group of misfits and a washed-up hero? I'll tear you all apart." But Jackson wasn't listening anymore. The only thing on his mind was the orb, the rift, and the small, fragile hope he still had. The energy in the room crackled with unbearable intensity, and Jackson could feel it pulling at him like an invisible force, threatening to tear him apart. The orb hovered between him and Thorn, its pulse growing ever stronger, a deep hum vibrating through the very air. The recruits were spread out, trying to regroup and form a defense, but the pressure of the orb's energy was making it hard to think straight, to act. Even Claire, still recovering from her last attempt to shield Jackson, looked exhausted, her energy flickering and fading. Thorn, his hooded figure barely visible in the dim light, stood at the center of the storm, a cruel smile playing on his lips. His hands, outstretched toward the orb, were enveloped in crackling energy, as though he were trying to take control of the rift itself. "You still don't get it, do you, Jackson?" Thorn's voice was cold, mocking. "You can't stop what's coming. This is bigger than you, bigger than any of us. It's the future. And you're already obsolete." Jackson's pulse raced. He knew this moment had been building up for years, ever since he'd first seen the rift Thorn had opened. The power he had once wielded, the confidence, the pride, he'd thought he could take it all back. But as he stood there now, his body heavy with exhaustion, his mind sharp with the knowledge that this was the endgame, the truth hit him with a clarity that took his breath away. He wasn't the hero anymore. But maybe, just maybe, the people who were watching him, the recruits who had been by his side through all of this, still had a chance to make a difference. Jackson took a deep breath, his mind racing. He couldn't fight Thorn head on. He was out of time, out of energy, and his powers were nothing compared to what Thorn had tapped into. No, this wasn't a battle of strength. It was a battle of wills, a battle for the future. He turned to Claire, her expression set with determination despite her obvious exhaustion. "Claire, I need you to focus. You've got to hold the orb in place. Use everything you have, even if it's just a sliver of what's left." Claire blinked, startled by his sudden request, but she nodded, resolute. "I can't. There's too much." "I know," Jackson cut her off gently, "but we don't have a choice. We've been fighting for control over powers, but what Thorn is doing is beyond any of us. We can't fight him with power alone. You've got to help me shut it down. Together." She met his gaze, eyes wide with fear and uncertainty, but beneath it Jackson saw the spark of hope, the same fire he used to feel when everything seemed possible. That was enough. "On my count," Jackson continued, his voice low but filled with purpose, "we use everything we've got. We don't hold back." Before Claire could respond, Thorn's voice rang out again, colder and sharper than before. "You think you can stop me with that?" he sneered, his arms raised in a dramatic gesture. "I've already seen the future. The world you're trying to protect, it's already gone. You're just too blind to see it." The orb pulsed, and the energy surged forward like a tidal wave, slamming into the recruits and knocking them off their feet. Claire cried out in pain, her body crumpling under the pressure. Jackson's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't falter. This was it. The moment had come. He dove forward, reaching Angela's side. She was still unconscious, but he could feel the faint pulse of her life force. He placed a hand on her shoulder, steadying himself. He had to stay grounded to keep his mind clear. With a steady breath, he focused his energy, drawing on the last remnants of power he had left. He reached out for Claire, whose hands were trembling but still glowing with a faint blue light. She was struggling to maintain control, but Jackson could feel her energy beginning to fade. "I'm ready," Claire gasped, her eyes locked onto his. "What now?" "On 3, Jackson said, the weight of the moment heavy in his chest. 1, 2... The moment hung in the air, thick with anticipation. Thorn was still laughing, a sound that grated against Jackson's nerves. "You're too late, Jackson. You've already lost." 3, Jackson shouted. At that instant, Claire's energy surged, a beam of bright blue light shooting toward the orb. The ground beneath them trembled as the orb flickered and shifted, its pulsing rhythm slowing down. The light from the orb intensified, and for a moment, Jackson thought they might succeed. But then Thorn's laughter grew louder, more manic. "No, you can't control it!" The orb's glow exploded outward, pushing Jackson and Claire back with the force of a blast. The recruits, struggling to regain their footing, staggered to their feet once more. The shockwave of energy reverberated through the entire building, and Jackson could feel the walls beginning to crack. "Claire! Hold on!" Jackson shouted over the roar of energy, his voice full of desperation. She was barely holding on. Her body was shaking, her face pale with strain, but her hands were locked onto the energy beam, struggling to contain the force surging from the orb. The ground trembled again, and Jackson's heart skipped a beat. The rift wasn't just threatening the building anymore, it was threatening everything. Time, space, reality. Everything was on the line. Jackson's mind raced. He couldn't keep this up. They couldn't keep fighting the orb and Thorn with brute force alone. He needed something else, something deeper. His gaze flickered to the recruits, their faces grim but determined. They weren't fighting for power anymore. They were fighting for each other, for a future. "Now!" Jackson yelled. With that single word, everything shifted. The recruits surged forward, their collective energy focused not on the orb itself, but on the bond between them. It was raw, unrefined, but powerful, stronger than any individual power had ever been. It was unity, the strength of human will. The orb shuddered, its glow flickering wildly. Thorn's smile faded as the very fabric of the energy began to unravel before him. "No!" he screamed, his voice laced with panic. "This is impossible." The orb pulsed one last time and then shattered. The explosion of light was blinding, a burst of pure energy that sent Jackson and the recruits tumbling backward, their bodies thrown to the ground. For a moment there was nothing but silence, the air still and heavy as though the world was holding its breath. Jackson's heart pounded in his chest, his body aching from the strain. He forced himself to sit up, his eyes scanning the wreckage. The orb was gone. Thorn was gone. But the room, the building, it was in ruins. Claire was the first to speak, her voice shaky but filled with disbelief. "We did it." Jackson nodded slowly, his gaze moving over the recruits now standing and dusting themselves off. There was a look in their eyes that hadn't been there before. Confidence, determination, hope, and for the first time in a long while, Jackson believed they could do this. They had stopped Thorn, they had stopped the rift, and in that victory, Jackson realized something even more important. It wasn't just about saving the world anymore, it was about building it again, together. The aftermath of the battle was quiet, eerily quiet, almost as though the island itself was holding its breath. The once chaotic air had settled, and the rubble from the shattered orb lay still, as if the universe was letting out a collective sigh of relief. Jackson sat against a ruined pillar, his back against the cold stone, eyes fixed on the wreckage that had once been a force of destruction. The power of the rift was gone, but so much else remained. The world felt both heavier and lighter all at once, as if reality itself was still finding its balance. The recruits, still shaken by the intensity of the battle, began to move about, checking on one another, gathering their things. It was surreal how quickly they adapted, how they seemed to be in sync with each other now, their bond stronger than ever. Jackson couldn't help but smile, albeit weakly. "Are we done?" Claire's voice broke through the stillness, her words quiet, as if she feared disturbing the fragile peace they had fought so hard for. She was crouching beside him now, her eyes wary but filled with relief. "Not yet," Jackson muttered, rubbing his eyes. He wasn't sure if he was more exhausted than he had ever been. or if it was just the weight of everything he had learned crashing down on him. The orb had been a powerful force, a rift that threatened to tear apart not only their world but time itself. But it had also been a mirror of Jackson's own life. The more he fought to control it, the more it fought back, revealing his own fears, his failure, his limitations, his aging body. And yet, it was the recruits, the next generation, who had saved them. Not him. It wasn't his power, but their collective hope, determination, and unity that had turned the tide. He looked over at Claire, who was tending to the others, her usual spark of determination and care evident in every movement. She'd grown so much in the time they'd spent together. He remembered when she was just another face in the crowd, one of the many recruits he had thought he could teach to be great. But now, she was his equal. The others were beginning to regroup, some beginning the long, exhausting work of rebuilding what had been destroyed, while others were starting to head toward the distant shores of the island, where the only escape awaited. Jackson knew what they had to do next. They had to leave the island. They had to rebuild, not just physically, but emotionally. They had been through too much for any of them to be the same again. Claire caught his eye as she approached, wiping a streak of dirt from her cheek. There was something different in her gaze now, something deeper, more knowing. "We did it," she said softly, a tired but proud smile tugging at her lips. "We did," Jackson agreed. But the relief he should have felt didn't come. Instead, an unspoken understanding passed between them. They both knew that victory hadn't been won by force or skill alone. It had been their willingness to stand together that had made all the difference. Without that, they might have never made it. "Do you think it's over?" Claire asked, her voice uncertain, as if she still couldn't quite believe they had won. "Not entirely," Jackson replied, "but we've put a dent in it, and that's enough, for now." He glanced over at the recruits, who were now discussing the next steps. Jackson's thoughts swirled, his mind still grappling with the monumental shift he had undergone. He had lost so much, his powers, his identity as a hero. But in their place, he had gained something unexpected. He had learned what it truly meant to teach, to lead not through sheer strength or experience, but through trust. The recruits, his new family, had saved him as much as he had saved them. He stood slowly, testing his legs. They were weak, sore from the battle, but they held him. Claire was already moving toward the edge of the camp, gathering her things, readying herself to leave. It was time to leave the island behind. To return to the world they had saved, to face whatever came next. Jackson hesitated for just a moment. "Claire," he called, his voice stronger than he felt. She stopped and turned to face him, her brow furrowing in silent question. Jackson paused, trying to find the right words. What was left to say after everything they had been through? What could he possibly say that would capture the complexity of their journey? He had lost his powers, his purpose, but not his sense of responsibility. And now, with everything shifting around him, he had to be more than just a leader. He had to be a guide, a mentor, not just for Claire, but for all of them. "I think I have something to teach you," he said finally. His voice wasn't confident, but it was steady. Her expression softened and she nodded. "I think you do," she said quietly, and that was enough. The recruits were beginning to move, gathering around Jackson and Claire. They had faced the worst, and now they could face anything. Together, they would rebuild. Together, they would train the next generation. There would always be threats, always be challenges to face. But there would also always be hope, always a future. As Jackson stood among them, watching them work, he felt a strange peace. It wasn't the peace of an easy victory or of the end of a battle, but something deeper. A peace earned through struggle, through loss, and through the knowledge that they were stronger than they had been before. The future was still uncertain, and the weight of what they had accomplished was heavy, but he felt it lifting bit by bit as the recruits continued their work. And somewhere, in the midst of all the pain and the victory, Jackson realized the truth. His time was over. But theirs was just beginning. As the last of the debris was cleared away and the recruits prepared to leave the island, Jackson stood at the water's edge watching as the sun began to set. He could see the faintest traces of light on the horizon, the first glimpse of a new world, the world that they would help create. And for the first time in a long time, Jackson allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, it was all going to be okay. He wasn't alone anymore. Together, they would shape the future. The last of the recruits had finally gathered by the shore, their faces tired but resolute. The sun was now low in the sky, casting long shadows over the water and turning the ocean a shimmering gold. Jackson stood beside them, his eyes scanning the horizon, where the sea met the sky in a blur of blue and orange. It was a peaceful moment, one he hadn't dared to imagine during the chaos that had once filled this place. Everything had changed. The island that had once felt like a prison had become a home, a place where lessons were learned, bonds were forged, and the future was shaped. The rift was gone, the orb destroyed. But Jackson knew the work wasn't over. The recruits were ready now. They had survived the trials, witnessed the destruction, and had learned how to rebuild, both the physical world around them and the future they would now shape. Jackson had trained them, yes, but he had also learned from them. He had watched Claire with her fierce spirit step into her role as a natural leader. He had seen Ethan's quiet determination, Sam's creative problem-solving, and Maya's empathy and bravery. Each one of them had something unique to offer, something that would help them succeed in whatever came next. The most profound lesson of all, however, had been the one he'd learned about himself. He had come to the island expecting to find the remnants of his old self, the superhero who had once saved the world. Instead, he had discovered a new path, one where leadership wasn't about strength, but about trust, vulnerability, and the willingness to help others grow. Ready to go? Claire's voice broke through his thoughts, her gaze steady, her confidence unshaken. Jackson looked at her, the weight of the journey still pressing on his chest. It wasn't easy to let go, to accept that his time was over, that the mantle of heroism was no longer his to bear. But he had seen the recruits step up, each one proving they could carry the torch. It was time to move forward. He could finally allow himself to rest. "Ready," he said, his voice firm but with a note of something deeper. Gratitude, pride, relief. Claire nodded, then turned to the others, signalling for them to begin their final preparations. Jackson had done what he could. Now it was their turn to step into the world they had fought to save. The air was heavy with the scent of salt water and the fading warmth of the day. The shore was now lined with small boats, crafted from the remnants of the island's materials, repaired and reinforced over the last few weeks. The recruits had worked tirelessly to prepare for their departure, gathering supplies and ensuring they had what they needed to start anew. It was a bittersweet moment as Jackson watched them, knowing that their journey was just beginning, even as his own was coming to a close. As the first boat was pushed into the water, Jackson stood at the edge of the shore, his eyes on the recruits. He had spent years chasing after a version of himself that no longer existed, but in these young people, he had seen something that made the loss worth it. They weren't just his students, they were his equals, his family. "Where do we go from here?" Maya asked, coming up beside him. There was no fear in her voice, just a quiet curiosity about the unknown. Jackson took a deep breath, the weight of the question sinking into him. "We go forward," he said simply, "one step at a time." Maya smiled, a soft, knowing smile that mirrored his own thoughts. She didn't need any further explanation. They all understood now. They had fought together, they had faced the rift and the challenges of the island, and now they were ready to face whatever the world had in store. Claire called out, her voice carrying over the now gentle waves. "We're all set! Let's go!" Jackson took one last look at the island, the place that had been both a prison and a sanctuary. It had given him everything he needed to let go of his old identity and embrace the future. He had learned to trust others, to let them lead and teach him in turn. The hero who had once believed he had to do everything alone had now become part of something bigger. He turned to the recruits, watching as they piled into the boats, each one eager and determined to start their new journey. Claire, Ethan, Sam, Maya, they were all there, ready to face whatever came next. There was no need for him to lead them any longer. They were ready on their own. As the last boat pushed away from the shore, Jackson felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He hadn't just taught them how to fight. He had taught them how to live, how to take what they had learned, how to make mistakes and grow, how to embrace the unknown with courage. He had passed the torch to them, and they would carry it forward. Jackson watched the boats disappear into the horizon, the final traces of the sun casting a soft glow over the water. It was the end of one journey, but the beginning of another. Not just for the recruits, but for him too. He had found peace, not in the hero he had been, but in the mentor he had become. "Goodbye, old friend." He whispered to the island, the words catching in his throat. "I hope you're proud of us." The island didn't answer, but Jackson didn't expect it to. He had found what he needed, and now it was time to step into the future. Whatever came next, he knew he would face it not alone, but with the strength of the new generation behind him. They were the future, their future, and they would rise. As the last light of the day faded into twilight, Jackson turned and began to walk away from the shore, his heart lighter than it had been in years. The future was theirs. And for the first time in a long time, Jackson felt ready to face it. He had done his part. The world was in good hands now.